All right, so this set of notes is going to cover China and Japan in the early modern period. So, at the same time that you're talking about the Mughals and the Ottomans and some of the things going on with the revolutions in Europe, we're also going to cover what's going on in China and in Japan. I'm also going to apologize if you hear some background noise. I have two kids that are awake right now, and they're working on trying to get lunch ready. My husband's working on trying to get lunch ready, so if you hear crazy noises, it's all right. So sorry about that. So with China, we've been talking about the Ottomans and the Mughals and international trade and interconnectedness and how Europe was making contact with the New World and the Columbian Exchange and all that's been happening. But China and Japan are going to approach that very, very differently. So China, as a rule, is going to try to limit what's going on in their country. They're trying to limit the access Europeans have to their cultures. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but not the least of which was that China was trying to preserve their way of life and preserve their culture. And they felt fairly, obviously rightfully so, knowing what we know about what happened in the New World, that if there was too much European influence, that they would lose their identity and their cultural heritage. So one of the things that they do is that they set up an enclave to control that trade. So an enclave is a small city or port that only the merchants of China and the merchants of Europe were allowed to be in. And it was only open for specific seasons. And that way there wasn't this influx of Europeans just wandering around in their cities. And that's what the imperial policy is, that the government, the empire, right, the government was controlling that system. There's also in Europe going to be an increased demand for lots of Chinese goods. We've talked in the past about Chinese goods, including silks and porcelains and tea and fireworks and gunpowder. But as Europe progressed, people wanted more and more and more of those goods. And so there was an influx of trade of merchants coming into China. But at the same time, they needed to back out on that to prevent the access. And so this is just an example of some porcelain. If you Google like Ming pottery, you'll see beautiful, ornate blue and white designs on porcelain. And that's what the Europeans were after. And I thought this was really interesting. This chart was really interesting. So in order to trade, you had to pay tribute. So a European coming to China to trade would have to follow these particular steps. So first, they have to bring gifts to the Chinese. So it's going to cost the merchants extra in order just to get there. They also had to do kneelings and bows to the ruler. They then had to be recognized by the government. So the emperor would then provide other goods, sort of as a yes, I see you, and you are welcome here. Then they were allowed to trade in China. And then periodically you had to repeat that whole step again. So you had to provide goods and pay your respects to the emperor before getting those rights to trade again. And so just to give you like an idea of the system, so the British sent someone named Lord Macartney to China in order to try and open up a trade relationship with the Chinese emperor at the time. And he gave 600 packages of gifts, 90 wagons, 40 wheelbarrows, 200 horses, and 3,000 porters all show up to pay tribute to the emperor. And then he didn't follow the step number 2 very well, and so they didn't get access. They lost all their stuff and they lost their right to trade. So it's very, very precisely controlled. Politically, they have an emperor there's several dynasties in China, but this is in particular is the Qing dynasty, the Qin dynasty, and the Manchus. And you can see how in the 1600s, the Mings were in control. So there's several different families, but how they're going to trade and be connected with spices and gems and ivory and silver. And you had to go, depending on what you wanted, you had to go to these particular places. But also you can see that it's largely based on agriculture, right? I didn't mean to cross that out. I meant to underline it. But you have horses here and spices, right? And rice and cotton. And all these things are goods that are grown. Obviously tea, also tea is a plant, right? And so those are all the things that they're trading. Shifting over just a touch to Japan. So geographically just to the east of China is the archipelago of Japan. And it's going to be ruled by something called the Tokugawa shogunate for several centuries. And you can see that Tokugawa Japan controlled the central part of Japan. Japan is volcanic islands, and so they're really hard for any feudal system in order to control all of it at the same time. And there's a lot in this time period of war that's happening in Japan. But ultimately, they do unite together as one solid country. The weird thing that's in existence, the different thing in existence about Japan, is that they do have a feudal system, just like Europe has had in the Middle Ages, right? Where you have a king and you have lords and dukes and barons and all the nobles, and then you have the peasants underneath them. But the Japanese actually have an emperor who has no power. He had absolutely no political power. He was a figurehead. He ruled by divine right. His family was a dynastic divine right system. But just like modern royal families in most of Europe, he has no influence over the government. That influence is none, though, not by parliament, as the system emerges in England, but as a shogun who is the leader of the military, and the daimyo, who are feudal warlords, right? So they are very wealthy landowners who have their own militaries. Under that were the warriors, the samurai. Under that is the peasants. And the artisans, and then under that is the merchants. And you can see by the chart that's very different from what emerges in Europe, right? Generally in Europe, the merchants are going to be a step above socially the laborers, the peasants and the laborers. But in Japan, they recognize that the peasants who are doing the farming and the artisans who are doing the manufacturing are actually more valuable to society than the merchants are. The merchants, as middlemen, aren't actually contributing to society at all. All they're doing is making money. So Japanese culturally, that was not as well preserved, not as well preserved, not not seen as noble of a position. So they were actually, a lower rank. The Japanese also are going to isolate, and I have that on a map, I think, on the next slide, so I can show you what that looks like. Yeah. And this is one of the Tokugawa shoguns. I'm not sure which one, but that's one of the Tokugawa shoguns depicted in a painting. Yeah, so they're going to trade, right? They're going to trade within the islands itself, though. So they have some maritime routes, they have some overland highway routes. But if you notice, those routes don't extend to the Korean Peninsula, they don't extend to China, they don't extend out anywhere, because they're going to become isolationists. They're going to stick to their own culture. That works for a couple of hundred years. Ultimately, you can't live, you can't industrialize, you can't grow your economy when you're not trading with other people. But it does keep in preservation the Japanese culture and the Japanese system for a very long time. And again, we've already talked about this powerless emperor system that they had going. So that's it. That's the last of it. So if you have any questions, as always, just let me know. And I'll see you guys soon.